He has just retired from his full professorship in chemistry at St. Lawrence, Canton, New York, where he taught 23 years. In the past 22 years, his research on waste management has taken him to 49 US and 48 other countries, where he has given approximately 2,000 pro bono public presentations. He's co-authored 6 peer-reviewed articles on dioxin and numerous other articles on waste management. Dr. Connet has researched literature on fluoride's toxicity for over 10 years. He helped found the Fluoride Action Network, for which he is the executive director, and he has challenged leading fluoridation proponents around the world to debate the science of the issue, but they have steadfastly refused even when invited to do so by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Please welcome Dr. Paul Connet to the podium.
Fluoridation and the arrogance of power. If you need to contact me, that's my email address, and I hope you do contact me, because we are looking for professionals who are publicly opposed to fluoridation. We need a long list of those professionals to offset the notion that the only people opposed to fluoridation are a bunch of nitwits. Okay, the outline. A definition of arrogance, 3 numbers, 3 agencies, 2 histories, 3 huge omissions by the United States Public Health Service, the CDC's protective veil, promoters' tactics, margin of safety versus Paracelsus, political power versus science, many moments when fluoridation should have been halted, why does fluoridation continue, how fluoridation can be stopped. A definition. Arrogance is ignorance backed up with overconfidence. 3 numbers, 3 agencies. 3 numbers, 0.04, 1, and 4. 0.04 is the level of fluoride in mother's milk, and you can see the documentation for that in the most recent National Research Council report. The CDC promotes fluoridation at 1 part per million, which of course is then 250 times higher than the level in mother's milk. Clearly, CDC knows more about fluoride's dangers than Mother Nature. The EPA regulates fluoride as a pollutant at 4 parts per million. And the FDA has never regulated fluoride as a drug for ingestion, and the official reason it was grandfathered in when the regulations came in 1938 for the regulation of drugs, because it was in use before 1938. But its use before 1938 was as a rat poison. So this is the most bizarre thing you could possibly imagine. The official history, most of you know this. It starts in the early part of the 20th century when the tooth discoloration is noticed particularly by a dentist called Mackay. It looked as if this unsightly condition did not lead to an increase in tooth decay. By 1931, they showed that this condition was caused by fluoride. The name changed to dental fluorosis. Between the 1930s and 1940s, Trendley Dean investigated this subject, and he was the one that characterized dental fluorosis into its different classes: questionable, very mild, mild, moderate, and severe. And Dean's famous 21 city study showed that at 1 part per million, it lowered tooth decay without causing much dental fluorosis. The trade-off was they would accept 10% of the kids getting dental fluorosis, but in its very mild category. In 1945, the first trials began. In 1949, this is just an aside, the sugar industry said in 1939, we need to find a way to reduce tooth decay without reducing sugar consumption. That probably had no influence whatsoever on the decision by 1950 for the US Public Health Service to endorse water fluoridation. And of course, not surprisingly, since it's the main funder of medical research in this country, many other endorsements quickly followed. The unofficial history is brought to you by Christopher Bryson, who spent 10 years writing the book, The Fluoride Deception. It's now in paperback. We have a 30-minute videotaped interview with Chris, which is available at our website and on Google. 22,000 people have now watched that. Bryson's well-documented thesis is that the US government colluded with industry in order to detoxify the image of fluoride, which at the time, in the 40s, was leading to numerous lawsuits, particularly from farmers whose cattle and crops were being damaged. But the larger concern, I believe, was that industry was concerned about what it was doing to its own workers. And the key events, the Denora incident in 1948, the Manhattan Project, the key players Gerald Cox, Robert Kehoe, Leone from the US Public Health Service, Harold Hodge from the Manhattan Project, and Edward Bernays, the father of propaganda. I urge you to watch the videotape, and if you like the video, you'll probably want to read the book. Fluoridation, in my view, should never have started because it violates an individual's right to informed consent to medication he or she takes. It's a really basic thing in modern medicine. It was violated in 1950. It's been violated for 60 years. And because the United States Public Health Service had no, I stress, no health studies to show it was safe when they endorsed it in 1950. All the data that they had was on teeth, the published data. There was some unpublished data on bone, but that was it. The gamble. The US Public Health Service gamble was that fluoride could damage the growing tooth, a systemic effect, by some mechanism without damaging any other tissue. In 1950, they had no evidence to support that proposition, and they have since 1950, the US Public Health Service has shown little interest in testing the proposition. Few resources have been put into studies on the possible effects of fluoride on any tissue other than the teeth, and a few studies on bone. If you don't look, you don't find. 3 huge omissions. It's been known from the beginning that the severity of dental fluorosis is a simple, non-invasive, and visible biomarker of exposure to fluoride in children. It has not been used by researchers supported by the government to investigate any childhood diseases and disorders which may be linked with fluoride exposure. So here you've got this beautiful biomarker, and it's not being used to look at things like onset of puberty, osteosarcoma, lowered IQ, hyperactivity in children, sleep disorders, lowered thyroid function. Any epidemiologist would jump up with such a biomarker, not being used. When fluoride is causing dental fluorosis in your children's teeth, what is it doing to their bones? Well, we got an answer. We got an answer from Mexico in 2001 by somebody who did use dental fluorosis as a biomarker. In a naturally high fluoride area in Mexico, they found a strong linear correlation between the severity of dental fluorosis and bone fractures in both children and adults. So down the bottom axis here, you see the severity of dental fluorosis, no, very mild, moderate, and severe. And here, the red dots is the percentage of children with bone fractures. And you see it's essentially doubles when you go from no dental fluorosis to very mild, and then doubling again to mild, and so on. Very striking. And although there are qualifications about some of the details reported, it's a very important study of what we should have been doing for 50, 60 years, using dental fluorosis as a biomarker. The second huge omission is even though it's known that fluoride concentrates in the bone, approximately 50% of all the fluoride that you take goes into your bone and gets stored there, no attempt has been made to systematically and comprehensively collect fluoride bone levels in the United States population and use this in investigations of osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, bone fractures, and so on, all maybe caused by fluoride or exacerbated by fluoride. Now, this is important because it's been well established for a long time that the levels of severity of skeletal fluorosis. In India and China, they make little difference between dental and skeletal. If you get dental fluorosis as a kid and you live in the same area, you're highly likely going to get skeletal fluorosis as an adult. And the early symptoms of the preclinical, clinical phase 1, and clinical phase 2 are remarkably similar to arthritis, stiffness of joints, pains in the joints, stiffness, and so on. And here are the levels of fluoride in the bone which is associated with that. These are I think, very loose. This needs to be updated. So my son and I set out to see what data had been collected. And I should say beforehand that arthritis affects 68 million people in the United States. 1 in 3 American adults have some kind of arthritis. So it's pretty serious. And we looked at all the data worldwide. The total number of data points that we could find in communities less than 1.3 parts per million was 1,400 data points. There should be millions. And in the United States, just 193. But in nearly all the studies, you can find people that are, the red ring refers to people in the preclinical phase, and the blue ring is clinical phase 1 of skeletal fluorosis, where you would expect to see arthritic symptoms. So here you see nearly every study, there's somebody in that preclinical phase, and in a few studies, a couple of studies, into clinical phase 1. By this point in time, we should have millions of data points. We should know what the levels of fluoride are in the bones of people who've lived in fluoridated communities for 10 years, for 20 years, for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. We have nothing. The third omission, doctors have not been taught about the symptoms experienced by people supersensitive to fluoride. It's extremely rare for a doctor to order a simple urine test to gauge if a patient has been overexposed to fluoride, what their daily dose is. Or even simply to recommend that they avoid fluoride to see if the symptoms clear up. George Woolbot did that and published many studies on those case studies, and so did Hans Muhlenberg in the Netherlands. His practice as a general practitioner, half the patients were from fluoridated Amsterdam and the other half were from non-fluoridated Haarlem. And so he would see these symptoms occurring, particularly from the fluoridated communities, and all he did was to say, stop drinking fluoridated water, and if the symptoms cleared up, he put it down to fluoride, and if they didn't clear it up, it was something else. And he reckoned up to 4% of the population was sensitive to fluoride from this stuff. Now here's going to more recent stuff, this is 10 years ago. In this follow-up, after ending water fluoridation, you'll notice here some of the symptoms. You get rashes. The people who are sensitive get rashes, stomach problems, headaches, and so on. And these rashes, they said, a small segment of the population may have some kind of intolerance to fluoride. The government has never followed up on this. It's always dismissed as anecdotal, and they quote some allergy association as being the final word on this. This is just contemptible in my view that the government is not doing its job. There's a pyramid of protected liabilities. The fluoridated dental products industry, Colgate and so on, is protected by the approval of the ADA. The ADA protects these guys. And then you've got the ADA is being protected by the CDC. As long as the CDC is saying it's the best thing since sliced bread, these guys can get away with it. And as long as these guys are saying fluoride is great, then these guys get away with it. Now, the CDC's protective veil. In 1999, the CDC stated that fluoridation is one of the top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century. This statement is a convenient skirt behind which many officials and editorial writers can hide their ignorance and avoid investigating the issue for themselves while enthusiastically endorsing the practice. And this is happening practically every day. There's hardly a day goes by that somewhere in the world this statement does not appear in an editorial, in an article, or out of the mouths of a health official. The report on which it was based was not externally peer-reviewed and was written by one dentist, Scott Tomar, who has since left the CDC. The defense of this statement in this article published in 1999 is appalling. This is what they said on safety. This is all they said on safety. The safety and effectiveness of water fluoridation has been reevaluated frequently, and no credible evidence supports an association between fluoridation and any of these conditions. This was the list of health concerns stated as being articulated by opponents of fluoridation. When you look at the reference 25, you'll see it's from a National Research Council review of 1993, and that means that in 1999, when the CDC is telling the whole world that this is the best thing, and it's perfectly safe, the only evidence they have is 6 years out of date. Well, you can look at the studies that were in the literature between 1993 and 1999, and this is a gross lack of due diligence from my perspective on what you should be communicating to the public in terms of health effects. And then what about benefits? It's even worse. Here's this simplistic, there's only one figure in the whole study, it's this simplistic curve which shows mean DMFT, decayed, missing, and filled teeth, in 12-year-olds in the United States, coming down from the 60s to the 90s. And on the same graph, this red line is the percentage of the American population drinking fluoridated water. One is going up, and the other is going down. Voila, cause and effect. This is coming down because that is going up. Now, the sale of bicycles was probably going up in the same fashion. If a student of mine tried to get away with crap like that, they would fail. But, you know, if you would have expected that the prestigious agency called the Center of Disease Control would have at least compared this graph here with what was happening in other countries. And so let's do it. Based upon World Health Organization data, this is what was happening between the 1960s and the 1990s in all these different countries, only 4 of which are fluoridated. The red line is the United States. 16 are unfluoridated. And you'll see that they're all coming down in that same period, and in many of them at a greater degree than the United States. So to put this forward as a serious defense of the effectiveness of fluoridation is absolutely appalling in my view. But they get away with it. So, and everybody that says, the CDC says that fluoridation is the best thing, the top 10 public health achievements, is actually sort of saying, I've looked at this and I agree with them. You know, it's pathetic because they don't read anything, they just read the sentence. The promoters' tactics. Repeat ad nauseum that fluoridation is safe and effective. Every time they say that in public, they get a royalty. They claim that the issue is beyond debate. It's amazing to me as a scientist to have any issue put beyond debate. It was beyond debate in the 1960s. In fact, no grade A studies demonstrate effectiveness. York Review. There's no grade A studies, no double-blind, random control studies. Key health studies have never been undertaken by either the US Public Health Service or these other countries that practice fluoridation have never done any of the health studies. Promoters' tactics, a two-pronged strategy. One, cite a long list of agencies and associations which endorse fluoridation, and 2, denigrate opponents as a vocal minority, ill-informed, using junk science, and so on. Let's look at the first. This is from the ADA, Fluoridation Facts. Here's the long list of agencies that supposedly endorse fluoridation. Almost a self-fulfilling prophecy once the US Public Health Service endorsed fluoridation in 1950. Follow my leader, follow the money. The ADA. Now, how much, well, I'm talking to the IAOMT. I don't have to tell you that the ADA doesn't have much scientific credibility, but for the public it does. But I want to give you an illustration. How reliable is the ADA on this subject? The ADA actually actively discourages its members from public debate on fluoridation and even tells them that they need not study the scientific literature. Look at this statement. Individual dentists must be convinced that they need not be familiar with scientific reports of laboratory and field investigations on fluoridation to be effective participants in the promotion program, and that non-participation is overt neglect of professional responsibility. That is the most bizarre definition of professionalism I've ever seen. You don't have to know the subject to go and promote it, and if you don't promote it, not knowing the subject, then you're not being professional. Give me a break, George. George Orwell, please read this from your grave. Promoters' tactics, denigrate opponents, blah, blah, blah. Let's give you a very recent example. Here's a professional PhD, DMD, in January of this year. None other than Ernest Newbern. Don't vomit. Ernest Newbern. Why does opposition to community water fluoridation continue? For no good reason. Top reasons why opponents do not like water fluoridation. It's too hard to spell. It doesn't have the fresh mint taste like the one you get at the dentist. Who needs fluoride? We're all going to wear dentures anyway. Somebody's got to stop these 61-year-old newfangled ideas. 37,000 studies is not enough information to make a decision. Little suffering is good for your character, and they don't like to use the F word. Anti-fluoridation types are right-wing extremists, misguided environmentalists, chiropractors, elderly concerned about costs, food faddists, anti-science naturalists, self-proclaimed neutrals, I don't know what that is, born-again anti-fluoridationists. Well, here is one of those crazy people that spouts all this crazy nonsense. This is an example of one of the crazy things he said. He said, it's against all modern principles of pharmacology. It's obsolete. I don't think anybody in Sweden, not a single dentist, would bring up this question anymore. Who is this crazy person? Dr. Arvid Carlsson won the Nobel Laureate Prize for Medicine in 2000. How on earth can a professional in 2007 come up with that claptrap when you've got people like this making statements like this? It's bizarre. What motivates the opponents? This is back to Newbron. Fluorophobia, sin and punishment, bad dieters deserve rotten teeth, oppose government intervention in healthcare, paranoia, belief in government, industry, health professional conspiracy, instant recognition, fame or notoriety. And in the conclusion of his lecture, he says, a small but vocal minority continue to oppose this proven public health measure for a variety of reasons, none of which are scientifically valid. The tactics. Back again to the tactics. This is me, not Newbron. They argue vociferously from solo platforms. They're good on paper, they're good in advertisements, they're good when they have the sole platform at public hearings. But they avoid public debates like the plague, where scientific opponents can provide evidence on lack of effectiveness and dangers. They are adept at answering their own questions. I love these questions you want to answer about fluoridation, which they produce glossy brochures, but we ask them to answer their questions, and they won't do it. I presented this to the Irish government in the year 2000. It took them 4.5 years before the first response to those 50 reasons appeared anonymously on their webpage with no communication with me. And it was absolutely hodgepodge of chaotic response. Newbron again. Ponent's comparison with fluoride, treating it as a poison, is with arsenic and lead, whereas what he says is the accurate comparison should be between iodine, iron, zinc, vitamins, and essential elements, for which he says all are toxic in excess. So he wants us to put fluoride in the context of nutrients. But fluoride is not a nutrient. There's no evidence that it is. And the level in mother's milk tells you it's not a nutrient, otherwise nature screwed up. But what about this last sentence? All are toxic in excess. They love this. It's the Paracelsus. Paracelsus says the dose makes the poisons. Everything's poisonous. It's just a question of dose, dose, dose. And so what they want us to believe, that every study that's come out to date, it only shows fluoride dangerous at high doses. The problem with this is that they never define what high dose is. They don't explain what high is, and what they don't do, and is a critical omission, is not to discuss margin of safety. So let's look at what margin of safety means to a professional toxicologist or pharmacologist. They would tell you that if you're going to expose the whole population in an uncontrolled fashion, you would want a margin of safety, sometimes referred to as the therapeutic index, between the toxic dose and the therapeutic dose of at least 100. You need a factor of 10 to allow for different sensitivities in any human population. I know of no substance where you don't have this range of sensitivity, either toxic or medication. We will want another factor of 10 to allow for the variation in doses. People drink vastly different amounts of water. And in other words, if we fluoridate water at 1 part per million, we wouldn't want to see a toxic effect in humans at less than 100 parts per million. Or if you're looking at animals, less than 1,000 parts per million, because we need an extra factor of 10 when going from animals to humans. Thus, for water fluoridation, there is a totally inadequate margin of safety. This is what we have. At 1 part per million, we have animal studies which shows that fluoride increases the uptake of aluminium into the brain. We have dental fluorosis impacting now 30% of American children. Increased bone fractures in children, that's the Larson-Herrera study. I put a question mark by that because there are questions about that study. 1% of the population is hypersensitive to 1 milligram of fluoride per day. That's 1 liter of water. Osteosarcoma in young men, I should be discussing this in more details in a moment. Lowered thyroid function in Mexico at 1 part per million. This is a PhD thesis unpublished yet. At 1.5 parts per million, doubling of hip fractures in China, tripling at 4.3 parts per million. At 1.8 parts per million, lowering of IQ in children in China. By the way, there have now been 18 studies from China which indicate that fluoride lowers IQ. We're getting many of those translated from the original Chinese right now. At 2.3 parts per million in the Ukraine, lowering of thyroid activity, and at 3 parts per million in the United States, lowering of fertility rates in the United States in counties with 3 parts per million or more. So, you know, not everything is proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. It seldom is. But if you don't want a toxic effect less than 100 parts per million, and we're going to fluoridate at 1 part per million, and we're seeing these things, the policy is preposterous by any normal toxicological or pharmacological reference point. You can find the details of these health risks at our webpage, /health. There you'll see all the health effects discussed by tissue, and of course, these risks are also discussed in the National Research Council document, this one. I'm happy to say on August the 12th, 2003, I think the single most important day in 10 years for me was being the only opponent of fluoridation that testified in person to the committee. And all that science that I had been gurgitating out in public platforms around the world up to that point, I was able to give to this group, this 12-membered panel, which was the first truly balanced panel of experts that have ever looked at this subject. It was very satisfying indeed to give it to people that would really count on this matter. And they did, after 3.5 years of deliberation, produce this report. And now I'm going to discuss political power versus science, and we can see it in the context of this report. The science, this is this National Research Council publication, 500 pages, 1,000 references. The authors identify severe dental fluorosis as a health effect. That's important. It's always been treated as a cosmetic effect before. They conclude that the maximum contaminant level goal of the EPA, 4 parts per million, is not protective against bone fracture. They recommend that the EPA lower the MCLG and do a health risk assessment to determine a new MCLG. They document many other health concerns, effects on the brain, on the kidney, on the thyroid, on the other endocrine system components. And they recommend many new studies be undertaken. Studies, incidentally, that should have been done 50 years ago, or better still, 60 years ago before they even started this. And they indicate that subsets of the population are already exceeding safe doses simply by drinking water at 1 part per million. So even though their mandate was to see if this was satisfactory, in their exposure analysis in Chapter 2, they indicate that some people are already getting unsafe doses even at 1 part per million. Now the power, the political power comes into action. On the same day that the NRC released this report, the ADA claims it is not relevant to water fluoridation. Give me a break. Within 6 days, the Center for Disease claims that the NRC findings are consistent with their policy that 1 part per million is safe and effective and continues its aggressive promotion of fluoridation. Now I just would like to quickly point out a double standard. If you remember back in 1999, what was the sole reference that fluoridation was okay, safe? The review by the National Research Council in 1993, when the same panel, the same agency, does exactly the same investigation at the same request of the same agency, the EPA, and they come back and say 4 parts per million is not safe. This time, they say it's not relevant to water fluoridation. So in the past, they've used it. They used the NRC to say everything is fine. And now, when they come back and say everything is not fine, they say it's not, essentially, it's not relevant. Neither body had time to study the 500 pages of this report, let alone many of the 1,000 references, many of which were made public for the first time as far as people in the United States are concerned, because they took a lot of studies from the Chinese, Indian literature, and so on. Neither body waits for the EPA to do the recommended health risk assessment or determine a new MCLG. Neither body offers its own risk assessment and a new MCLG. And note The minimum MCLG that the EPA could come back with at this point is 2 parts per million, because it's absolutely clear the moment you classify severe dental fluorosis as a health effect, then the cutoff point for that seems to be 2 parts per million. So anybody drinking water above 2 parts per million has a strong risk of getting severe dental fluorosis. So that would be the maximum. So now you're trying to operate between 1 part per million and 2 parts per million. 1 part per million good, 2 parts per million bad. And we can't control how much water people drink. And we can't control how much fluoride they get from other sources. How can you operate such a public policy? Political power versus science, a case study, osteosarcoma. In that first study, Newburgh-Kingston, actually it was the second study, but it was done in 1945 to 1955, reported by Schlesinger in 56. This is the National Academy of Sciences looking at this study with hindsight, 21 years later. This study observed a higher instance of cortical bone defects in the children in the fluoridated community versus the non-fluoridated community. 2 to 1. Unbelievable. The cortical bone is the outside layer of the bone, very critical in protecting against fractures. So wouldn't you think when they saw this that they would start being very worried about what it was going to do to children's bones? No, they didn't think it was significant. The National Academy of Sciences continues in that quote. Caffey, who did the x-rays, noted the age, sex, and anatomical distribution of these bone defects are strikingly similar to that of osteosarcoma, while progression of cortical defects to malignancies has not been observed clinically. It would be important to have direct evidence that osteosarcoma in males under 30 have not increased with fluoridation. That's the